My name is Poppy Whitmore. I'm 36 years old, a mother of one extraordinary little boy, and until recently, I was a wife people described as steady, reasonable, and easygoing. I live just outside of Manchester in the UK, in a quiet neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever seems to happen, at least not on the surface. If you met me at the school gates, you probably wouldn't remember me. I'm the one holding a reusable coffee cup, smiling politely, listening more than I speak. I've always been the calm one in the room, the woman who doesn't interrupt, the woman who doesn't escalate, the woman who understands. And for a long time, that's exactly who I believed I was. What most people never realize is that silence can be a decision. Calm can be discipline, and understanding can sometimes be a strategy. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about drama, and it certainly isn't about destroying anyone. It's about a moment when the person who thought he understood me best looked across a solicitor's table and realized he never truly saw me at all. He threatened to take full custody of our son. He said it calmly, confidently, like it was already decided, like I should prepare myself to lose. And in that moment, I understood something very clearly. He believed I would panic. He believed I would cry. He believed I would beg. Instead, I did something else. There was one truth he had spent years praying I would never reveal. One quiet, documented, undeniable truth that didn't require shouting, didn't require public humiliation, and didn't require me to become someone I'm not. The day his own lawyer read that evidence aloud, his confidence didn't explode. It didn't shatter theatrically. It dissolved, slowly, quietly, irreversibly. But that moment didn't happen overnight. It was built through years of small dismissals, subtle shifts, conversations where I chose not to correct him, times I allowed myself to be underestimated because it served a larger purpose I hadn't fully understood yet. This is the story of how being invisible became my advantage. It's about emotional restraint, about documentation instead of confrontation, about knowing the difference between reacting and preparing. I won't dramatize what happened. I won't paint him as a villain, and I won't pretend I was perfect. But I will tell you exactly how a woman everyone thought was too soft to fight back became the most prepared person in the room. Have you ever been underestimated so completely that it almost felt like a gift? To my husband, Daniel, I was steady. That was his word. He used it often, usually when explaining to me about other people. Poppy's steady. She doesn't stress. Poppy's good with routine. Poppy's not really career-driven. She prefers home. It always sounded like praise, and perhaps in his mind it was. To his friends, I was lovely. To his mother, I was sweet, if a little quiet. To the solicitor he would later hire, I suspect I looked like someone who would fold under pressure. I wasn't invisible. I was just background. I handled the school forms, the dentist appointments, the packed lunches, the winter coats that needed replacing before anyone noticed they were too small. I worked part-time at a local primary school, not because I lacked ambition, but because someone needed to be available at 3:15 every weekday. Daniel worked in corporate logistics. Long hours, travel, dinners that ran late, promotions that required flexibility. He was respected, confident, decisive. I was the support system, and I agreed to that arrangement. That's important. I didn't feel trapped. I believed in partnership. When our son Oliver was born, we decided, together, that one of us needed to prioritize stability at home. Daniel would say, "It just makes sense financially." And on paper, he was right. What he didn't see was that I never stopped observing. When you're the quieter person in a room, you learn things. You notice patterns. You remember who says what and when. You learn how tone changes before words do. Daniel didn't think I tracked those shifts. Why would he? I never confronted him about them. When he began introducing me as basically a stay-at-home mom, I smiled. When he joked that I wouldn't survive corporate life, I laughed politely. When he started making decisions about finances without consulting me first, I asked calm questions instead of raising objections. It looked like compliance. It wasn't. It was data. There's something about being underestimated that gives you time. Time to listen. Time to collect. Time to decide who you are without needing applause for it. At school, parents trusted me with their children's anxieties. They'd say, "You're so patient." Patience is often confused with passivity. It isn't. Patience is a delayed reaction. For years, Daniel believed I didn't fully understand our financial structure. He assumed I didn't grasp legal terminology when it came up in passing conversation. He assumed I was too emotionally attached to ever make a strategic move. He believed I would always prioritize harmony over leverage. And perhaps at one time, I would have. But when small comments started shifting from teasing to dismissive, when financial decisions became unilateral, when I realized he spoke about our son's future as if it were something he alone was shaping, I began keeping notes. Not secret recordings, not dramatic screenshots, just documentation, dates, expenses, school drop-offs, doctor visits. missed recitals due to urgent meetings, travel schedules that contradicted what he told people publicly. Not because I planned to use them, but because I never again wanted to doubt my own memory. To Daniel, I was soft, adaptable, non-confrontational. To everyone else, I was kind. What no one asked was whether kindness can coexist with preparation. And the truth is, it can. For a long time, I was exactly who they thought I was, until I wasn't. The first small cut didn't look like a threat. It happened on a Tuesday evening in our kitchen while Oliver was upstairs building something elaborate out of mismatched Lego pieces. Daniel had just returned from a 2-day work trip to London. His coat was still draped over the chair. His phone sat face up on the counter, lighting up every few minutes with emails he didn't open in front of me. I was rinsing plates when he said it. You know, if anything ever happened between us, Oliver would probably stay with me. He said it casually, almost thoughtfully, like he was commenting on the weather. I dried my hands slowly. What do you mean? Well, he shrugged, leaning against the counter. I mean, financially, it would make more sense. Stability, better school options, that sort of thing. There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just an assumption. I remember noticing how calm he looked, how certain. I nodded once. That's an interesting conclusion. He smiled, mistaking neutrality for agreement. I'm just being realistic, Pops. Realistic. That was the first cut. Not because he mentioned custody. We'd never even argued seriously at that point. Not because he believed he earned more. That was objectively true. It was the quiet presumption that I would accept his version of reality without question. That my role as Oliver's primary caregiver could be reduced to a line item in a financial comparison. The next morning, I packed Oliver's lunch the way I always did. Crusts off, apple slices soaked briefly in lemon water so they wouldn't brown. I walked him to school. I chatted with another mom about reading levels. Outwardly, nothing shifted, but internally something recorded itself. That evening, after Oliver was asleep, I opened my navy leather planner and wrote down the date. I didn't write what Daniel had said verbatim. I simply noted, conversation re hypothetical custody, assumption based on income. No emotion, no commentary, just a fact. In the weeks that followed, I paid attention in a different way. I noticed how often Daniel referred to money as leverage in other contexts, how he framed security as something he alone provided. At dinner with friends, someone joked about prenups. Daniel laughed and said, well, in this house, I'm definitely the asset. Everyone chuckled. I smiled. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't loud, it was almost charming, but it revealed something. He didn't see our son as rooted in presence. He saw him as secured by provision, and perhaps that's how he'd been raised. Perhaps it wasn't malicious, but I couldn't unhear it. The first small cut isn't supposed to bleed dramatically. It's subtle. It stings later when you replay it in silence. I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid, but because confrontation would have given him a chance to soften it, to reframe it as a joke, to accuse me of overreacting. Instead, I watched. I began saving copies of school newsletters with my name listed as primary contact. I made sure medical records were digitally organized under my email. I kept receipts for extracurricular fees I paid from my account. Again, not with a plan, with clarity. Daniel never mentioned custody again that year, but something had changed in me. I no longer assumed we saw our roles the same way. And once you see that misalignment, you can't return to innocence. The first small cut didn't hurt loudly. It hurt quietly. And quiet pain, I've learned, is the kind that builds resolve instead of drama. After that Tuesday evening, nothing exploded. There were no slammed doors, no ultimatums, no visible cracks in the walls of our marriage. That's how normalization begins. It doesn't announce itself, it repeats. A few weeks later, Daniel corrected me in front of friends about our savings plan. We were at a dinner party. Someone asked whether we were thinking of moving to a larger house now that the market was favorable. I started to explain that we'd been prioritizing Oliver's education fund first. Daniel interrupted gently. Not exactly, he said with a light laugh. I handle the investments. Pops prefers not to get bogged down in the details. It was delivered warmly. His hand even rested briefly on my back. Everyone nodded approvingly, as if that division of responsibility made perfect sense. I smiled and took a sip of water. What I didn't say was that I had built the initial spreadsheet for that education fund, that I had researched the tax implications. I knew precisely how much sat in each account, but correcting him in that moment would have shifted the atmosphere. It would have required an explanation. It would have made me appear defensive, so I let it pass. At school, I often mediated small playground disputes. Children would insist with absolute certainty that they were right. Sometimes they weren't malicious. They were simply convinced of their own narrative. Adults aren't very different. Over time, Daniel's small corrections became habitual. He'd answer questions directed at me. He'd summarize my opinions before I finished expressing them. He'd rephrase my ideas in business language, as if translating them for the room, and I began rationalizing it. He's confident, I told myself. He's used to leading meetings. He doesn't mean to overshadow me. When he traveled more frequently, he'd say things like, "You're lucky you get all this time at home." Lucky, as if school runs and meal planning were leisure. I didn't argue, because arguing would have required proving my value out loud. And I didn't want to beg for recognition, so I adapted. I began speaking less in group settings. I chose my words more carefully. I stopped offering spontaneous opinions that might later be reframed. It wasn't withdrawal, it was calibration. But here's the dangerous part about normalized disrespect. The longer you tolerate it quietly, the more others assume it's accurate. Daniel began making larger decisions without consulting me first. Booking holidays around his work calendar, reallocating savings for better returns, even discussing secondary school options with colleagues before mentioning them at home. When I raised gentle questions, he'd say, "Trust me." And I did. Not because I was naive, but because trust felt less exhausting than contest. Somewhere along the way, the narrative solidified. Daniel was the strategist. I was the nurturer. He provided direction. I provided warmth. It sounded balanced. But balance requires equal weight. What he didn't realize was that while I appeared to be shrinking socially, I was expanding privately. I started reading more about family law in the UK, not obsessively, just curiously. I learned how courts actually assess custody. I discovered that primary caregiving patterns carry weight, that financial dominance doesn't automatically determine parental authority. I didn't tell him I was learning these things, because at that stage, I still believed knowledge was for reassurance, not defense. Normalization is subtle. It persuades you that something slightly uncomfortable is simply how things are, until one day, you realize the role you've been cast in isn't the one you auditioned for. And by then, everyone else has memorized the script, including him. There's a moment when you realize you've been assigned a character in someone else's narrative. Not asked, assigned. For me, it happened during a Sunday lunch at Daniel's parents' house. His mother was describing Oliver as so lucky to have such a driven father. She turned to me kindly and added, "And of course, a mummy who keeps everything ticking along." Keeps everything ticking along? It was meant as praise, I know that. But the phrasing stayed with me. I wasn't shaping anything. I wasn't building anything. I was maintaining, preserving, supporting, functional, replaceable. Later that afternoon, Daniel and his father were discussing property investments in the garden. I joined them briefly, mentioning an article I'd read about shifting interest rates. Daniel smiled indulgently. "That's more my department," he said. "Poppy prefers people to numbers." The conversation continued without me. I walked back inside, not embarrassed exactly, just repositioned. That was the role. Reliable, useful, emotionally intelligent, financially peripheral. The woman who ensured the home ran smoothly while the real decisions happened elsewhere. I began noticing how consistently that framing appeared. At school events, Daniel would arrive late and charismatic, shaking hands with other parents, joking with teachers. I would already be there, having signed permission slips, volunteered for reading sessions, and coordinated bake sales. When praise came, it often went to him for being so involved. I was assumed. Invisible effort is a strange thing. It's only noticed when it stops. And somewhere inside me, a quiet question formed. What would happen if I stopped? Not out of spite, not as a test, but as an experiment. Instead of automatically filling gaps, I waited. If a form needed signing, I left it on the kitchen counter with a pen beside it. If a school email required a response, I forwarded it without commentary. Daniel missed 2 deadlines in 1 month. The first time, he apologized and blamed the workload. The second time, he said, "You usually handle this." Yes, I usually did. I wasn't punishing him. I wasn't setting traps. I was observing dependency patterns. The role I'd been assigned wasn't passive. It was foundational. And foundations are powerful precisely because they're unseen. Around that time, Daniel began speaking more confidently about future contingencies, hypotheticals about what would happen if either of us decided we wanted different things. He always framed it abstractly, theoretical, mature, but there was a subtext. He believed he would remain the stable axis around which Oliver's life revolved. I stopped correcting him, because correcting would have required proving. And proving requires performance. Instead, I refined my internal clarity. I reviewed our joint accounts. I ensured my part-time income was consistently documented. I quietly increased my professional certifications at school, positioning myself for full-time opportunities if needed. Not dramatically, not urgently, just steadily. Daniel didn't notice the shift because it didn't disrupt anything. Dinner was still cooked. Oliver was still thriving. The house still ran smoothly. Outwardly, I remained exactly who I'd always been. But internally, I stopped identifying with the role they'd assigned me. I wasn't the steady one. I was the consistent one. And consistency, when properly documented, becomes evidence. He believed I was dependent. What he didn't realize was that I was simply strategic. There's a difference. And he was about to learn it. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after a cruel remark or a dramatic discovery. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in the school car park. Oliver had run ahead of me, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. He turned back halfway across the pavement and waved. "Mom, you're coming, right?" Such a simple question. Of course I was coming. I was always coming. Always there at pickup. Always present for reading days and assemblies and fevers at 2 a.m. But the way he asked it, so certain, so anchored, landed differently that day. To him, I wasn't steady. I wasn't supportive. I wasn't secondary to anyone's income bracket. I was home. That realization didn't inflate me with pride. It grounded me with clarity. Later that evening, Daniel called to say he'd miss Oliver's parent-teacher meeting due to a last-minute opportunity with a potential client. "I'll catch the summary from you," he said. "You're better at that stuff anyway. Better at that stuff." I sat at the small desk in our bedroom after the call ended, staring at my planner. I'd already written the meeting time down weeks ago. I'd rearranged my school shift to attend. And suddenly, for the first time, I didn't feel accommodating. I felt aware, not angry, not resentful. Aware that patterns had hardened into assumptions. Aware that he believed my flexibility was infinite. Aware that if the hypothetical custody conversation ever became real, he would present himself as the stable provider who simply worked more. That night, after Oliver fell asleep, I opened my laptop and did something I hadn't done before. I created a digital folder labeled simply documentation. Inside it, I began organizing what I already had. Attendance logs from school events, emails from teachers are primarily addressed to me, medical appointment confirmations, holiday schedules show Daniel's travel overlapping with Oliver's milestones. There was no rush in my movements. It felt less like preparation for battle and more like arranging files in a cabinet. Clarity is calming. I also booked a quiet consultation with a family solicitor the following week. I didn't tell Daniel, not because I was hiding an affair of the heart, but because I was protecting knowledge. The solicitor, a composed woman in her early 50s, listened carefully as I described our situation in neutral terms. No abuse, I clarified. No instability, just an imbalance of narrative. She smiled slightly at that phrase. When I asked how custody is typically determined in the UK, she answered plainly, primary caregiving patterns matter. Documented involvement matters. Courts look at reality, not income alone. Reality, and not income alone. The air left my lungs slowly. For years, Daniel had spoken as if financial provision was the central pillar, as if stability were measured in salary bands. But reality, daily presence, documented consistency carried weight. I walked out of that office without adrenaline, without triumph, just alignment. The shift wasn't about defeating him. It was about no longer doubting myself. Back at home, Daniel kissed my cheek distractedly while scrolling through his phone. "How was your day, Pops?" "Productive," I replied. And it was, because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to small cuts. I was recalibrating my future, silently, intentionally. The day something shifted, nothing exploded. But the balance of power adjusted inside me. And once internal balance changes, external outcomes eventually follow. After that consultation, my silence changed shape. Before, it had been adaptive, a way to keep peace, a way to avoid unnecessary friction. Now it was deliberate. Daniel didn't notice immediately. Why would he? Outwardly, I remained composed. Meals were still prepared. Oliver's routines were intact. Conversations were cordial. But internally, I stopped hoping he would suddenly see me. Hope can make you passive. Clarity makes you strategic. When Daniel began speaking again about long-term plans, if we ever separated, framed casually as though discussing weather contingencies, I didn't respond with reassurance or discomfort. I asked neutral questions. What makes you feel that way? How do you imagine working logistically? What schedule do you think would suit Oliver best? He interpreted my calm curiosity as acceptance. In reality, I was mapping his assumptions. He spoke confidently about school catchment areas near his office, about private tutoring options, about how children adapt quickly. He never once asked how Oliver might feel spending most weekdays away from the home he'd always known. That omission told me more than any raised voice could have. Silence became my observation tool. When Daniel missed another school function due to travel, I didn't express disappointment. I took photographs. I saved the program. I made a note of the date and his stated reason for absence. Not out of spite, but because memory fades, documentation doesn't. There's a misconception that strength is loud, that power announces itself with declarations and ultimatums. In reality, power often looks like restraint. Daniel began mistaking my restraint for resignation. One evening, during a discussion about refinancing part of our mortgage, he said, "You don't need to worry about the technicalities. I'll handle it." I met his eyes calmly. "I know you will." That answer unsettled him slightly. I saw it. He expected pushback or gratitude. Instead, he received neutrality. Neutrality doesn't feed the ego. Around that time, I increased my working hours at school from 3 days to 4. I framed it as professional development, which it was. Daniel approved easily. Good for you, he said. See y'all, lad. Keeps you busy? Busy. What he didn't realize was that the additional day strengthened my documented employment stability. It expanded my independent income history. It reinforced my network within the school community. Strategic silence isn't manipulation. It's preparation without announcement. There were moments, of course, when emotions surfaced privately. When I lay awake, wondering how we'd drifted into this quiet power imbalance. When I questioned whether I was overinterpreting harmless comments. But each time doubt crept in, I returned to facts. Patterns, statements, absences, assumptions. Facts are grounding. The more composed I became, the more Daniel relaxed into his confidence. He began speaking with subtle authority about worst-case scenarios as though they were already resolved in his favor. He believed he was preparing mentally for a separation I wasn't capable of navigating. He didn't understand that my silence had shifted from peacekeeping to positioning. And positioning is invisible until the moment it matters. By then, it's too late to reinterpret history. Silence had become my choice. Not because I was weak, but because I was ready. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed. Daniel certainly didn't. From his perspective, life continued smoothly. Oliver thrived at school. I managed the house. We attended social events. There were no shouting matches, no ultimatums, no visible fractures. But beneath that calm surface, I was building structure. The first thing I did was standardize everything. I created a shared digital calendar for Oliver's activities. Not new, just more detailed. Drop-offs, pickups, doctor appointments, parent meetings, extracurricular clubs. I logged who attended each one. When Daniel was present, I noted it without commentary. When he wasn't, I noted that too. There was no emotion attached to the entries, just timestamps. I ensured that the school formally listed me as the primary contact and emergency decision maker. It had always been that way informally, but now it was clearly documented in writing. At medical appointments, I asked for copies of summaries. At school events, I volunteered in visible roles: reading coordinator, field trip supervisor, not for recognition, but for the record. Consistency is persuasive. I also reviewed our financial arrangements carefully. Despite Daniel handling investments, I had full legal access to our joint accounts. I downloaded monthly statements and stored them securely. I familiarized myself with mortgage terms, pension allocations, and savings vehicles. Not because I intended to contest everything, but because understanding removes intimidation. There's something powerful about sitting in a room later and knowing you are not financially illiterate simply because someone assumed you were. At school, I discreetly spoke with the head teacher about long-term opportunities. I didn't mention my marriage. I simply expressed interest in increasing my qualifications and hours. She was supportive. You're reliable, Poppy. We'd be lucky to have you full-time. Reliable. The word landed differently when it came from someone who understood its value. Meanwhile, Daniel's travel schedule intensified. Promotions require presence, and presence often means absence at home. Each trip added another entry to my quiet ledger. Oliver began instinctively turning to me for logistical questions. Mom, where's my kit? Mom, can you sign this? Mom, are you coming? Daniel would overhear and sometimes joke. Do I exist in this house? It was meant lightly, but existence in a child's daily rhythm isn't symbolic, it's cumulative. What Daniel never noticed was that I stopped filling in for him socially. If he forgot to inform another parent about a playdate he'd agreed to host, I didn't rescue the situation immediately. I allowed him to experience mild inconvenience, not to embarrass him. To rebalance accountability, I also kept copies of our written communications, emails, texts, messages where he confirmed travel during key school dates, messages where he referenced finances as primary leverage in any potential separation. He never thought twice about those messages. Why would he? There was no hostility in them, just confidence. Confidence leaves trails. One afternoon, while organizing files, I stumbled across something older. Documentation from Oliver's early years. Hospital discharge notes listing me as sole overnight caregiver during a period when Daniel was unable to attend due to professional obligations. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't neglect, but it was evidence of a pattern. I didn't celebrate finding it. I simply filed it. Preparation is rarely emotional. It's methodical. The more I organized, the calmer I felt. Not empowered in an aggressive way, anchored. Because I understood something Daniel didn't. Custody decisions aren't won by charisma. They aren't secured by income alone. They're shaped by documented reality. And reality, over the years, had quietly recorded itself in my favor. He saw himself as the architect of our future. He didn't realize I had been drafting blueprints of the past. And when the past is carefully preserved, it becomes leverage without cruelty. No one noticed. That was the point. The discovery didn't happen in a dramatic burst of revelation. It happened on a quiet Thursday night, long after Oliver was asleep, when the house felt unusually still. Daniel was away in Edinburgh for what he described as a critical expansion meeting. I had heard that phrase enough times to stop asking for specifics. I was updating my documentation folder, routine by then, when I opened an archived email thread from 3 years earlier. It was from a period I remembered clearly. Oliver had been 6. He'd developed recurring chest infections that winter. Nothing life-threatening, but persistent enough to require multiple GP visits and 1 overnight hospital observation. Daniel had been traveling frequently that quarter. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Work was demanding, promotions were competitive. I handled the medical visits. I slept in the hospital chair beside Oliver's bed. I texted Daniel updates. But that night, as I reread the thread, something stood out. Daniel had forwarded one of my hospital updates to his manager. The message read, "Can't make tomorrow's early call. Domestic situation under control. Wife's handling it." Domestic situation under control. Wife's handling it. There was no cruelty in the words, no anger, just distance. I scrolled further. Another email surfaced. This one to a colleague. Daniel wrote, "Thankfully, Poppy's flexible. I'd struggle to juggle all this otherwise." Struggle to juggle. I paused. Because in the hypothetical custody conversations years later, he had framed himself as the pillar of stability, the primary provider, the axis. Yet here, in his own unguarded professional correspondence, he acknowledged that his career trajectory depended on my availability. Not abstractly, explicitly. Without my flexibility, his advancement would have been compromised. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. This wasn't about catching him in deception. He hadn't lied. He had simply constructed a public narrative, later, that omitted these dependencies. And courts don't respond to narratives. They respond to patterns. That was the private reveal. Not that he'd done something illegal. Not that he'd betrayed us in some cinematic way. But that his own words documented a truth he later minimized. He could work the way he did because I absorbed the domestic unpredictability. Every fever, every half-day dismissal, every unexpected childcare gap. It wasn't emotional leverage. It was structural leverage. I printed those emails the next morning and placed them in a thin file folder. No triumph, no shaking hands, just clarity settling deeper. For years, Daniel had spoken as if my role were optional, as if in a separation scenario, Oliver's life could be rearranged neatly around his income. But his career itself had been arranged around my constancy. The irony wasn't bitter. It was mathematical. That realization shifted something fundamental inside me. If he ever attempted to frame himself as the more stable parent, the documentation would quietly contradict him. Not through accusation, but through chronology. He had prayed, in a subtle way, that I would continue protecting the narrative of him as a singular provider. And I had, until I understood that protecting the narrative meant erasing my contribution. The private reveal wasn't explosive. It was stabilizing. Because now if the conversation ever became formal, if the threat of full custody left the realm of hypotheticals, I wouldn't need to argue. I would only need to present. And presentation, when backed by someone's own words, requires no raised voice. I closed the folder gently. For the first time, I didn't feel reactive. I felt prepared for inevitability. The actual words came on a Monday evening. Not hypothetical, not abstract. Clear. "I've spoken to a solicitor," Daniel said, standing near the dining table, as if discussing quarterly projections. "If we move forward with separation, I'll be seeking full custody." There it was. No raised voice, no anger, just confidence. Oliver was upstairs finishing homework. The house smelled faintly of tomato sauce from dinner. Ordinary details, framing an irreversible sentence. I folded the dish towel carefully before responding. "Full custody," I repeated, not as a question, as acknowledgement. "Yes," he said, maintaining steady eye contact. "It's practical. I can provide more stability long-term, better schooling options, stronger financial base. I don't want to disrupt Oliver's future." Disrupt. The implication hovered between us, that remaining primarily with me would constitute instability. In that moment, I felt something unexpected. Not fear, relief, because ambiguity had ended. For years, I had been preparing for a possibility. Now it had form, shape, timeline. I nodded slowly. "If that's your position," I said calmly, "then we'll both need representation." He blinked, slightly thrown off by the absence of emotion. "I assumed you'd agree we should handle this amicably." "I agree," I replied. "Amicable requires clarity." He studied my face, searching for panic. There wasn't any. Inside, I felt the quiet weight of choice settling into place. This was the decision point. I had options. I could negotiate from fear. I could accept a secondary arrangement to avoid conflict. I could appeal emotionally, remind him of bedtime stories, hospital chairs, school gates. But emotional appeals would validate his framework, that custody was a matter of persuasion. It wasn't. It was documentation. I chose the irreversible path. I contacted the solicitor I had consulted months earlier and formally retained her services the following morning. No announcement, no dramatic email, just paperwork. Daniel continued speaking confidently over the next few days about timelines and logistics. He discussed potential living arrangements as if already resolved in his favor. I don't want this to get messy, he repeated. Neither did I. Messy is loud. This would be precise. That week, I finalized digital copies of every relevant document. I organized them chronologically. I cross-referenced travel schedules with school records. I included the archived emails where he acknowledged reliance on my flexibility. Not accusatory, factual. The irreversible decision wasn't hiring a solicitor. It was deciding that I would no longer protect a narrative that erased me. Up until that moment, I could have continued absorbing assumptions, continued smoothing over implications, continued playing the role assigned. Once formal proceedings began, that was no longer possible. There is a particular calm that arrives when you choose alignment over comfort. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold. Court outcomes are never guaranteed, but I knew something Daniel did not. He believed he was initiating from a position of dominance. In reality, he was stepping into a process where quiet consistency outweighs confidence. The decision wasn't about defeating him. It was about standing fully inside the documented truth. And once you do that, retreat becomes impossible. Not because of pride, because of principle. I sealed the envelope containing my solicitor's retainer agreement and placed it beside my planner. No shaking hands, no tears. Just the steady awareness that the next phase would not be conversational. It would be evident, and I was ready for that. Once the paperwork began, everything became quieter. Not outwardly. Outwardly, life looked the same. Oliver still needed breakfast at 7:10. School still began at 8:45. Laundry still cycled through its predictable rhythm. Daniel still left early for work, tie perfectly aligned, confidence intact. But beneath the surface, motions were unfolding that required no announcement. My solicitor advised restraint. No emotional messages, no reactive conversations. Let communication remain logistical and written whenever possible. That suited me. Written communication leaves clarity. Daniel sent an email outlining his proposed structure for custody. It was framed as generous. He suggested that Oliver live primarily with him during the school week and spend alternate weekends with me. Alternate weekends. I read the sentence twice. To anyone unfamiliar with our daily life, it might have sounded balanced. To anyone who knew reality, it was absurd. But I didn't respond with outrage. I forwarded the email to my solicitor and replied to Daniel with one line. Received. I'll respond formally through representation. Short, controlled, undeniable. Meanwhile, I continued strengthening the foundation. I secured a letter from the head teacher confirming my consistent involvement in school activities over the past several years. Not requested dramatically, simply documented as part of routine employment verification. I gathered medical summaries, showing me as the primary attendee at appointments. I compiled attendance logs. I organized financial statements demonstrating joint contributions, including my consistent allocation toward Oliver's expenses. I also reviewed our mortgage structure carefully. Despite Daniel's frequent language about my income, the home was legally shared. Equity was not theoretical. Nothing I did was aggressive. It was administrative. Daniel, on the other hand, began increasing his visible presence. He attended one school assembly that he had previously planned to skip. He volunteered for a Saturday football session. To an outside observer, it might have looked like dedication. To someone tracking chronology, it looked recent. Courts value patterns over gestures. I didn't comment on his newfound availability. I simply continued documenting. At home, conversations became measured. Daniel would say, "I don't understand why you're making this so formal." "I'm not," I'd reply evenly. "I'm following advice." Advice. He didn't like that word. It implied a structure beyond his control. The most significant move I made during that period was financial. Quietly, I opened an independent savings account in my name and began redirecting a portion of my income there. Entirely legal, entirely transparent within our shared financial framework. Not to hide funds, to establish independence. Security changes posture. Daniel still spoke with underlying assurance, but I noticed something subtle beginning to shift. His emails became slightly longer, more explanatory, as if trying to reinforce the narrative he assumed would prevail. Confidence, when challenged by silence, starts filling space. I did not fill it with emotion. I filled it with documentation. The date for our initial legal meeting was set. A neutral conference room. Both solicitors present. Daniel believed he would articulate his case persuasively. He had always been good in meetings. What he hadn't considered was that this wasn't a meeting of opinions. It was a presentation of history, and history, when preserved carefully, doesn't require performance. The morning before the meeting, I reviewed my files one final time. No theatrics, no rehearsed speeches, just chronological truth. He had moved first with confidence. I had moved second with structure. And structure, when aligned with reality, rarely needs to raise its voice. The first legal meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. Neutral office, frosted glass walls, a long polished table that reflected everything placed upon it. Daniel arrived early, impeccably dressed, composed. He nodded at me courteously, as if this were a professional negotiation rather than a restructuring of our family. Our solicitors exchanged formal greetings. Folders were placed on the table. laptops opened. Daniel spoke first. He outlined his proposal clearly. Primary residence with him during the school week, structured visitation for me, assurances of continuity and opportunity. He framed it as practical, rational, forward-thinking. His solicitor nodded along, reinforcing key phrases like stability, financial security, and academic advantage. I listened without interruption. Then my solicitor began. She didn't counter emotionally. She didn't question Daniel's character. She simply opened a folder and started reading through documented caregiving patterns, school attendance records, medical appointment logs, confirmation letters from staff, travel schedules overlap with key developmental events, date after date, fact after fact, no adjectives. I watched Daniel's posture change almost imperceptibly. Not dramatically, just subtly. His shoulders, previously squared with certainty, began to settle back into the chair. When the archived emails were referenced, the ones where he described my flexibility as the reason his career remained uninterrupted, his solicitor paused briefly to read them in full. The room was very quiet. There was no accusation in the reading, no emphasis, just text. Domestic situation under control. Wife's handling it. I saw Daniel's jaw tighten slightly. It wasn't shame. It was recalibration, because for the first time, the narrative wasn't being spoken by him. It was being reconstructed through chronology. His solicitor asked a few clarifying questions. How frequently were you present at weekday medical appointments? How many school pickups did you complete in the last academic year? The answers were factual, quantifiable, not in his favor. No one raised their voice, no one accused, but the balance of assumptions shifted in that room. Consequences rarely begin with explosions. They begin with realization. By the end of the meeting, Daniel's initial proposal had softened. He began referencing Varstowwood arrangements and flexibility. What's best for Oliver emotionally? Language evolves when certainty weakens. Outside the building afterward, he approached me. I didn't realize you'd been compiling things, he said carefully. I wasn't compiling, I replied. I was living. That was the truth. Documentation had not been manufactured for conflict. It had accumulated naturally through presence. Over the following weeks, negotiations adjusted. His requests became less absolute. His solicitor advised a more balanced, shared care structure, aligned with existing routines. Daniel's confidence didn't vanish overnight, but it fractured, because he had expected persuasion to win. Instead, consistency spoke. At home, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Not hostile, just unsettled. He began asking Oliver more specific questions about school. He double-checked calendar entries. He reviewed homework more attentively. Not performative, but reactive. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, as recalibration. For the first time, Daniel understood that custody wasn't determined by projection of authority. It was shaped by documented reality. And reality, quietly and without spectacle, had already recorded itself. The meeting had not ended in drama. It had ended in adjustment. And adjustment is often the beginning of irreversible change. The weeks after that first meeting were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, not tense, just altered. Daniel no longer spoke about full custody as if it were inevitable. The language had shifted to shared parenting and practical balance. His solicitor, I suspect, had explained the weight of documented caregiving patterns more directly in private. But something else shifted too. Regret began appearing in small, almost imperceptible ways. One evening, Daniel lingered at the kitchen counter while I prepared dinner. I didn't mean to make it sound like you weren't central, he said, searching for the word. Central. I continued slicing carrots evenly. You made it sound like income was central, he exhaled. I was thinking long-term security. So was I. There was no anger in my tone. That unsettled him more than if there had been. He began offering to handle more weekday responsibilities. Volunteering for school pickups, rearranging meetings to attend football practice. Some of it was genuine, I could see that. But timing matters. Courts don't weigh sudden bursts of involvement as heavily as sustained patterns. Daniel wasn't foolish, he understood that. One night, he sat across from me at the dining table, hands clasped. Why didn't you ever say something? He asked quietly. About what? I wondered. About being minimized? About being reframed as optional? I met his eyes. You weren't asking. Silence settled between us. He looked as though he wanted to rewind years of casual phrasing, to edit out assumptions spoken lightly at dinner parties, to retract the confidence with which he'd threatened full custody. But history doesn't erase because someone finally sees it. It stabilizes. The second legal meeting was less confrontational than the first. Proposals were revised. Shared residency aligned closely with Oliver's existing routine, primarily with me during school weeks, extended time with Daniel on designated evenings, and alternating weekends. Balanced, familiar, realistic. Daniel agreed without theatrical resistance. That was when I understood something fully. He had believed the threat of full custody would intimidate me into negotiation from weakness. He hadn't considered that I might already be prepared. Not to attack. After the meeting, he walked beside me to the lift. I didn't expect, he began, then stopped. You didn't expect me to have records? I finished gently. He didn't deny it. His confidence hadn't shattered in a dramatic collapse. It had dissolved the moment his own lawyer read the evidence aloud. Not because the evidence was explosive, because it was undeniable. And once denial evaporates, control follows. At home, Daniel became quieter, less declarative, more reflective. But by then, the dynamic had permanently shifted. Even if reconciliation had been possible, even if apologies had flowed freely, something foundational had already recalibrated. You can't unknow that someone underestimated your role in your own child's life. You can't unknow that they viewed your presence as negotiable. It wasn't anger that made it too late to fix. It was awareness. And awareness, once settled, doesn't reverse itself for comfort. The process moved forward, steady, documented, final, and for the first time in years, I felt no need to shrink inside anyone else's narrative. Because the narrative had been corrected, quietly, irrevocably. The final structured conversation happened in our living room. No solicitors, no conference table, just the two of us, seated on opposite ends of the sofa Oliver used for Saturday morning cartoons. By then, the shared care agreement was nearly finalized. Schedules outlined. Financial responsibilities allocated. The formal language of separation was drafted. Daniel looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not defeated, just recalibrated. I misjudged you, he said plain charmlessly. There was no defensiveness left in his voice. I didn't rush to fill the silence. He continued, choosing his words carefully. I thought you'd prioritize peace over position, that you wouldn't want to make things formal. I did prioritize peace, I replied evenly. For years. That wasn't an accusation. It was a timeline. He nodded slowly. I didn't realize how much you were carrying. The statement hung between us. I considered correcting it, explaining that I hadn't been carrying alone, that I had chosen many parts of our arrangement willingly. But this wasn't the moment for rewriting history in either direction. I wasn't carrying it alone, I said calmly, but I was present for it. Present! That word mattered more than any legal term. Daniel leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. When I said I'd seek full custody, I believed I was being practical. I know, I answered. And when your solicitor started reading those records, he paused, a faint exhale escaping. I realized practicality isn't the same as reality. There it was. Not humiliation, recognition. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list sacrifices. I didn't replay dismissive comments from years prior. There was nothing to gain from that. Instead, I spoke the only truth that mattered. I never wanted to win against you, I said. I wanted Oliver's life to remain anchored. He absorbed that quietly. For a moment, the air between us felt almost gentle. I didn't see how anchored he already was, Daniel admitted. That was the closest thing to an apology he could offer without unraveling his own pride entirely. And I didn't require more, because this confrontation wasn't about extracting remorse. It was about closing the gap between assumption and fact. He had assumed income equaled leverage. He had assumed calm equaled compliance. He had assumed silence equaled absence of preparation. Each of those assumptions had dissolved, not under attack, but under documentation. Daniel looked at me differently that evening. Not as steady, not as supportive, as an equal. Perhaps for the first time. We'll make this work, he said quietly. We already are, I replied. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no emotional crescendo, just two adults acknowledging that the version of the story he had been telling himself was incomplete, and that incomplete narratives don't survive evidence. When the conversation ended, we both stood. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just closure without combustion. And in that stillness, I understood something deeply. True confrontation doesn't require heat. It requires clarity. And clarity, once spoken, doesn't need to be shouted. I used to think strength was something you proved, something visible, something acknowledged by other people. Now I understand it differently. Strength is alignment between who you are privately and how you stand publicly. The separation was finalized without spectacle. Shared residency was structured around Oliver's existing rhythm. School weeks primarily with me, extended and meaningful time with Daniel. Financial arrangements reflected reality, not assumption. Life did not collapse. It adjusted. Oliver adapted with the quiet resilience children often have when adults manage their emotions responsibly. He has 2 homes now, but 1 routine. 2 parents, but 1 consistent center. And I am no longer steady in the way people once meant it. I am deliberate. I returned to full-time work at the school within a year. Not because I had to. The settlement ensured stability. But because I wanted to step fully into my professional identity without apology. The head teacher promoted me to pastoral coordinator. I now help families navigate transitions, divorce, illness, change. I never tell them my story, but I understand their silences. Daniel and I communicate efficiently now, respectfully, We attend school events without tension. We make decisions about Oliver collaboratively. The difference is subtle but profound. There are no more offhand comments about assets, no more jokes about who handles real decisions. He doesn't overcorrect. He doesn't dramatize. He simply includes, not because I demanded it loudly, but because reality required it. Sometimes I reflect on the woman I was during those dinner parties, smiling politely while being gently minimized. I don't judge her. She wasn't weak. She was observing. If anything, I respect her patience more now than I did then. Because she didn't explode at the first small cut. She didn't escalate when dismissed. She prepared. There's a quiet dignity in knowing you never lied, never manipulated, never exaggerated. Everything I presented was already true. I just stopped protecting a narrative that erased me. Today, when I walk through the school gates, I no longer feel invisible. Not because people suddenly applaud me, but because I see myself clearly. That clarity changes posture. It changes tone. It changes how you occupy space. Daniel once believed he could redefine my role with a sentence about custody. Now he understands that roles aren't assigned. They're demonstrated over time. And time, when documented honestly, doesn't betray you. I am still calm, still measured, still unwilling to shout for validation, but I am no longer underestimated. Not because I became louder, because I became undeniable. And that difference, quiet, structured, principled, is the most stable version of power I've ever known. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that quiet doesn't mean powerless. For years, I believed that keeping the peace was the same as protecting stability. And in many ways it was. Peace matters, especially when children are watching. But peace without clarity slowly reshapes you into something smaller than you are. I didn't win because I shouted louder. I didn't win because I exposed secrets publicly. I didn't win because I destroyed someone's reputation. I won because I knew my own reality, and I preserved it. When he threatened to take full custody, he believed confidence would carry him. He believed income was influential. He believed I would crumble under the weight of formal language and legal tone. What he hadn't considered was that calm women can be deeply prepared. The moment his own lawyer read the evidence aloud, his confidence didn't shatter with drama. It dissolved with recognition. Recognition that history had already been written. Recognition that presence is measurable. Recognition that consistency leaves a paper trail. There was no revenge in it, only correction. And correction doesn't require cruelty. If you're in a situation where you feel overlooked, minimized, or quietly dismissed, I'm not telling you to retaliate. I'm not telling you to escalate. I'm telling you to observe, to document, to understand your actual position instead of the one someone assigns to you. Power isn't in humiliation. It's in alignment. Today, my son sees two parents who respect each other. That matters more to me than any legal victory. And I see myself clearly, not as steady, not as supportive, but as foundational. Have you ever been underestimated in a way that later became your greatest advantage? I'd really like to know.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.